Master, see my deeds!
That's my kill.
Reginald here. The time has come to complain about chain weapons. We're not going to do just a little complaining. We're going to deep dive complain. We're going to complain about all the stuff that matters most about chain weapons and why they're not any good and why they're not any fun. So hold on to your hats because we're going in. There's a lot of problems with chain weapons, of course, but let me start by telling you a story. See, when I first got into Darktide, I was pretty excited and I was having a darn good time. And I actually started playing as a veteran because I thought that would be the most fun to use the lasgun in a game. After all, I don't think there has been a game where I've been able to use a lasgun. So, you know, I was pretty excited to be shooting the old trusty lasgun at things and pretending to be a guardsman while getting killed by things. It was good. I liked it. And I mostly used the Chainsword and the shovel all the way up until my upper levels for my first playthrough. But then I finally got the Chainsword, and boy, I was excited because, man, it's 40k time. We're gonna chainsword some stuff. And I started hitting things with it and feeling kind of unpleasant, kind of uncomfortable, like, hey, wait a second, why am I not killing stuff the way I was before? Is there any advantage to this weapon at all? And then I killed my first mauler with it, and I was like, oh boy, we're in business. I can actually melee elites at last. And that was pretty nice. I was pretty happy about that. It was pretty great to go from useless in a melee conflict with a mauler to pretty effective. Of course, then I discovered the axes, and it was all bets off. And the power sword outshone the thing completely, so what was the point? And wait a second, honestly, most of these other melee weapons are better than the chainsword. It's kind of bad. Actually, the more I spend time with this thing, the worse it feels. Can't kill anything, really. It's just so slow. After a long time and spending some time on the Zealot, I got back to the chain weapons. I got bored of all the good stuff and thought maybe I'd try something out. I went back to the chainsword and found it to still be kind of meh. Then I played around with the worst one I could think of to give myself a challenge, the chain axe. And that's kind of how this whole thing got started. I went from using essentially good weapons, and of course the thunder hammer, which is, you know, okay, to using what was widely considered at the time the worst weapon in the game, the chain axe. And then I went back around, and you've seen me go through tutorials on all the different weapons, and that's because I've been working my way through the chain weapons to figure out what works and what doesn't. When I was playing Zealot for the first time, I got really excited about the heavy chainsword. It felt like a chainsword for the most part. There was some problems, of course, but it felt like a chainsword for the most part, and I liked using it, only to discover that it was widely outclassed by other weapons. Once again. So I keep having this problem. I want to use the chain weapons, and I'm certainly good enough now to use the chain weapons at any difficulty. I've cleared a whole bunch of runs of High-End Shock Troop Gauntlet, and now Auric Maelstrom as well, with just the chain axe, and I spend most of my time in melee because I think it's the most fun. So it's not like I'm hurting here. And I do like them, even as they are. But the problem seems to be that the chain weapons are pretty inferior to other weapons, and I have the data to prove it. All of the chain weapons do less damage than the mundane counterparts, and they have fewer dodges, they have less dodge distance, they usually have inferior sprint speed, and they are typically weaker all around as weapons, and their time to kill against hordes is much slower, quite a bit slower in my opinion. The significant difference between around 10 seconds to kill time on 50 poxwalkers is a lot in my view. And then, when you account for all of that, the only upshot they have is this special attack, which is a very risky attack. It's really fun to do, and I don't want it changed in the sense of I don't want it removed, but it's very risky, right? So you have all these problems, plus you add on to that, for some of the chain weapons, you have a primary attack on the chain axe or a heavy attack on the eviscerator, which is your most common type of attack, which can get stuck on enemies and leave you revving against a target when you would rather be moving. Now, I'm not saying we should get rid of that either, but this is an obvious drawback, considering that they still don't beat mundane weapons for time to kill, or safety, or any other category of things. And my evidence that I'm not just sort of making mountains out of molehills here is that most players aren't running chain weapons. They're running mundane weapons, or they're running power weapons, or they're running niche-built weapons, but they're not running chain weapons. It's very rare for me to see someone else running a chain weapon that isn't just doing it for fun anyway. Usually such people are like me, doing it because they think it's really entertaining to play it, even though it's not good. Plus, I have the data to prove it. I haven't just been working on all this aggressive weapons testing stuff and tutorial stuff for no reason. I've actually been driving towards this point the whole time and just trying to prove myself wrong, just in case I was wrong. See, sometimes you don't know whether or not a weapon is bad because it's just got a bad reputation and people haven't figured out what makes it good yet, or if it's actually bad. And all I've proven, they're actually bad. They're not good weapons. They're kind of on the lowest end of most of the hierarchies. There's only a few weapons that tend to be worse, and in most cases those weapons are worse in that specific niche, but then they're better in another niche. The chain weapons are just mediocre at the armor busting niche, and they sacrifice a lot to do that, and then they're also really bad at horde clear and basic medium tier enemy clear. So they're not good at anything. They're like middle ground garbage, which is the worst kind of thing to be. Now that I've kind of justified why we're here and talking about this, let's go ahead and dive into it precisely. So the first thing I want to do then is actually set the stage properly by doing a micro tutorial of all of the chain weapons currently in Darktide, and then we're going to jump into a lore conversation to try and see sort of how they stack up against those weapons, and then maybe we can get into the actual balance internal to the game and some of the special effects and visual effects that affect the feel of the weapon. That's going to be the kind of overview for this. The role of a chain weapon in your kit is that of a generalist weapon. Each weapon has a slightly different specialization, but they more or less perform the same on balance. The chain sword sacrifices some of its high-end killing potential against Ogren and monstrosity type enemies for higher mobility and quicker strikes. The chain axe instead sacrifices some of the mobility of the chainsword to deal higher damage to elites and specialists and even Ogren type enemies and monstrosities, dealing as much as the heavy chainsword does. The heavy chainsword sacrifices even more of that mobility to gain a little bit more horde clear, at least based on the weapon, with heavy sweeping attacks that are able to cleave multiple opponents and stagger those that it doesn't outright kill. The heavy eviscerator, or the heavy chainsword as those of Bright Reason would call it, is interesting in that it has rather poor light attacks that aren't very useful for much other than quick staggering of enemy attacks or chaining from the heavy one attack into the horizontal swing light that comes back from it. The heavy one on the heavy chainsword is a big cleaving blow that will stop on elites or those of large enough hit mass to then saw for a second tick of damage, just like a chain axe light. The special attack is actually bifurcated into two different modes. If you do a charged heavy attack, heavy one, it will actually cleave through multiple targets, gaining extra cleave and damage, and then stop on any elite or enemy of heavy enough hit mass to saw for the full rev attack type damage. If you use an overhead instead, which is heavy too, you will do just a typical type of rev attack like the other two weapons. This profile is very similar to the chain axe and does about the same amount of damage, and so it's quite good for sniping elites, just like heavy one is if you just use heavy one against elites. Chain axe revved heavies do more damage than chain axe revved lights, but they both have good stagger. It's the push attack when revved that is helpful because it lets you get elites out of a horde by shoving the horde out of the way. The push attack on the chain axe is one of its strong points with high efficiency, good stagger, and decent cleave damage. The heavy attacks on the chain axe are repeatable, diagonal, cleaving blows with decent horde clear characteristics. Light attacks on the chain axe are probably the most controversial in that they have a latching behavior that sticks you to the target with your camera and does 2 ticks of damage. They are generally single target attacks with good stagger effects and decent damage, but they have interesting interactions with plus power blessings that can change their usage quite a bit. Chainsword lights come out quick but have little cleave without blessings. Heavy attacks will be your mainstay with an alternating swing pattern, good cleave, and adequate damage. The special attack on the chainsword is one of its main features. While it doesn't do as much damage as the other two weapons, it has the lowest ready time, and that makes it easy to get out in a hurry. Like all chain weapon special attacks, the chainsword deals 4 ticks of damage over time, starting low and ending on a high note. The beneficial exception to this rule is the chainsword's heavy special attack, which starts high and ends high with a sag in the middle. As mentioned earlier, all of these weapons have similar properties in that they have rather mid horde clear, rather mid single target damage. Their strengths center mostly around using the special rev attack to snipe elites, specials, and Ogren. That should be sufficient to get you up to speed on these weapons. Hey, I just did a tutorial on 3 weapons in less than 3 minutes. Subscribe. With that done, the next thing I'm going to want to do is discuss how the weapons are represented in the media about them and any kind of lore that's relevant. And the lore will be a quick conversation because the lore has always been a bit sketchy and vague, except in the books where they're mostly described as difficult to use, somewhat technically challenging weapons that are very powerful relative to, say, just a normal sword. So we'll just sort of take that as the baseline. Like, they're kind of hard to use, but they're good solid weapons. Here's how my 5th edition rulebook describes them. A chainsword is a high-powered chainsaw fitted with a hilt, pommel, and guard to make it less unwieldy. It is a common weapon across the Imperium, with a quite horrifying reputation for the damage it can inflict on unarmored flesh. Chain weapons aren't even described in my 4th edition rulebook. There are only 2 sentences in my Dark Heresy book of any relevance. The chainsword is thrust at the enemy where the spinning chain teeth can bite into flesh and bone, and chain axes are described as heavy, brutal weapons that deliver hideous damage with each blow. And the new 10th edition core rules don't seem to describe them either. As you can see, they've mostly left it up to our imagination how these weapons might work. As a consequence, I'd like to actually look at some media representations and use that as a guidepost for how these weapons are to perform in our collective imaginations over the decades. First up, the sort of OG introduction for many people in my generation, 240K, Dawn of War. This is from the first intro cinematic, and it is a sergeant using a chain weapon to attack several orcs. The first blow is a normal strike, a simple attack. The second blow is actually a hilt strike using the pommel, and the final strike is a hilt strike followed by an assassination using the chain weapon, like a rev attack. This next one is from Dawn of War 2's opening cinematic. I own both games. The first attack in this video clip looks like a special attack or a rev attack from Darktide, so very similar in this one. The second one, however, looks very much more like a draw cut using a chain weapon. You're not attempting to bisect the enemy or fully commit, you're just looking to do enough damage to wound them or injure them or kill them using the weapon more than your own strength. So this is probably likely considering he's being electrocuted right now, so he doesn't have a lot of power to use. So the draw cut makes sense. You're going to let the weapon, the engine, do the work for you. This looks to me a lot like a light attack with a chain axe, where you're doing the hit, but then getting a second tick of damage, but you're not really bisecting the enemy either. You're mostly letting the weapon do the work. So I'm going to talk as we go here. So in this first clip, the Sister Superior with the power sword is saved by a Space Marine using a chainsword. He's doing a full-on assassination attack, and it shows. That's just like our rev attacks in the game, so good enough.
Our darkest hour. The last bulwark.
So this is the trailer for 9th edition that was released by Games Workshop, and in it, one thing I really want to call attention to here is the chainswords are always revving very loudly, regardless of the attack that's being used. That's not the case in Darktide, and it's one of the things I want to address. Let's go to the next one. This is, of course, recorded from Boltgun, and it involves you striking the opponent and then continuing to smash the button to continue to melee, and that revs over time. It's actually kind of a fun little mechanic.
Eviscerate this abomination!
We are the angels of death.
This is, of course, from the gameplay trailer of Space Marine 2, and I didn't bother to go back and record Space Marine, because although I own Space Marine, it's identical here. Basically, you swing your weapon around, it makes loud revving noises, and it hits targets and cleaves them, and then you can initiate a special attack for assassination whenever you want to, as long as the opponent is staggered. At which point you will conduct an execution maneuver at risk to yourself while doing it. And this, of course, was from the announcement trailer of Space Marine 2, which was awesome. But what I really want to draw your attention to is these first 3 blows. They feel very much, to me, like what all the heavy attacks on the chain weapons are attempting to be like. They're cleaving blows with the chain weapon revved and roaring, but they don't get stuck on the target. They pass right on through, and usually bisect them and dismember them in the process. The final blow on that gaunt feels like it could be a special attack, but against this warrior, it's definitely a special attack. Alright, so what was the point of all of that? Well, it's simple. There's 3 types of attacks that are represented in the media, and they are as follows. Heavy, cleaving attacks that can cut an opponent in twain using the full revved power of a chainsword to deliver that blow and essentially glide the blow through the opponent. There is the typical chainsaw-like strike where you hit the opponent with the chainsaw and then saw into them for a bit, but you don't overcommit, as is in the case with an assassination attack. And then there's the full-scale assassination attack using the chain weapon, where you commit to a full-on revved attack and attempt to assassinate that target in one blow. These 3 core types of attacks represented in media have all shown up in Darktide in various ways. And it's my theory that one of the core problems that the chain's weapons have is actually a visual and sound effects feel problem. And I think that where the weapons don't line up with the media representations we've just gone through is precisely where the main problem with the VFX and SFX is. There's a common description for a lot of attacks on the chain weapons by players who are using them, where they're described as being like paddles or like hitting your enemy with a 2x4. And so I want to get into that VFX conversation here, and I want to do so by looking at the different attack types on the weapons and comparing them to the media representations we just went through. Let's do the chain axe first. I think it's probably doing the best out of all the weapons from a visual and sound effects feel perspective. The light attacks are pretty solid. I know their latching mechanic's a bit controversial, but they feel good to use once you get used to them. And the sound and visuals are stellar. For the heavy attacks, well, we definitely are getting that cleaving behavior, but it doesn't sound great when it hits flak. It's pretty bonky. I do notice, though, that it does rev when you swing it. It's kind of soft, and it doesn't really come through very well. But it's not awful either. One thing I do notice is that when you're holding back the attack, like you're getting ready to swing, it doesn't rev at all. Unlike the chainsword, which does sort of start up a little bit, and so does the heavy chainsword on those heavy attacks. That seems like an oversight here. Compare that to this. Sounds to me like chain axe heavies just need some rev before they swing. And just to sort of prove the point, I'm going to actually play a little bit of that again without any visuals. Just listen real close. So I noticed a couple things. There are some wet sounding effects like I'm hitting flesh, but then there's a lot of clanging as well. And the revving is really low on the balance. Like you can't hear it very well. So I think that's weak. But there's something else there too on both sides of the swing. At the start of the swing, there's no revving before you actually initiate the swing. And then on the end of the swing, there's nothing really either. It stops really quickly. There's no carry through between swings. Compare that to the heavy chainsword, where it actually carries over between swings. So it revs, swings, revs again, and then carries over into the next swing as long as it continues to be a heavy swing. Look, there's really not much to say about the special attacks. They sound, look, and feel awesome. Next up, chainsword lights. Okay, unarmored ain't bad. That sounds pretty good. Oops, sorry. All that banging made me think of a crusher. Seriously though, compare that to this. Or this. It sounds like I'm swinging a motorized frying pan, which isn't exactly what I want. Also, notice how all the hits just stop right on target? That happens for bruisers and maulers and anything wearing flak armor. They don't cleave at all. Next up is heavy attacks. While they rev nicely as you're preparing the swing, they cleave the target, they sound pretty decent, there's no obvious metal clanking. Against the Mauler, I'm pretty okay with this. I'm not cleaving the target and I'm sort of bouncing off the armor, right? But against these bruisers, I am cleaving them, so why am I making sounds that sound so much like a revved shovel instead of a revved chainsword? I think I'd like to hear this sound a little bit more in the slicing and cutting domain, unless I'm really like bouncing off their armor or something. Next up, the venerable heavy chainsword. Before hitting anything, lights sound good. Heavies sound good too, and I just want to call attention again to that revving sound that carries over. Something's wrong. Bonk. The heavy is good, but that light is awful. Alright, I know I let that play for a bit, but I've been trying to work this out for a while, and there's just definitely something that doesn't feel right, but it's really hard to put your finger on. And I've had to do this quite a bit and edit this quite a number of times to figure it out. So I wanted to bring you along on the journey instead of just telling you. Remember this video? I hate the Eviscerator.
Sanction Redactus.
The heavy chainsword. Yeah, me too, because there is no Eviscerator in Darktide. Is there? Is there? But why does that section work so well? Why am I able to take the sound effects from a shovel and from an Ogren club and apply them to the light attacks on the heavy chainsword and have it work? There's got to be something wrong. So let's just listen to it again and then compare it to some footage and maybe just the audio of the footage and try to see if we can work out what the problem is. Okay, well let's be honest here. That sounds pretty good. Like if we just listen to that with no visuals... This is exactly what I ran into. This actually sounds fine now that I'm looking at it closer. Let's just look at it maybe with no audio at all. There's definitely something wrong here, and it goes beyond just the sound effects or even the visual effects. I went and I tested a bunch of weapons today, and it's actually how the hits land and stay where they are that's making this feel so weird. Even the Crusher doesn't do that. Take a look. Okay, maybe the Crusher sticks around just a little bit, but it does kind of look like it's bouncing off. Whereas the last two attacks, light attacks for the heavy chainsword, really like stick around on the target. The first one kind of like cleaves a little, but not as much as you would expect. This is supposed to be a two-handed sword, not a hammer. Alright, I think we got everything here. The editing process on this has been pretty brutal, but I think we covered all the bases. Let's summarize the core problems that we've identified, and then maybe start talking about what to do about them, then anything else that's relevant. Leaving aside balance for now, let's just talk visual and sound effects issues. Number 1, chain axe heavies are quite thumpy and clangy. Number 2, chain axe heavies need rev sound effects before and after the swing, with carryover to the next swing. 3, chainsword lights hit like a motorized frying pan against high hit mass or high armor enemies. 4, chainsword heavies are kind of clangy against armor. 5, chainsword heavy attacks could use more rev carryover between swings like the heavy chainsword has. 6, heavy chainsword lights sound fine, but have 2x4-like properties visually. Alright, so I want to talk about two issues at the same time. That's the heavy chainsword light attacks and the chainsword light attacks. See, both of them sound kind of okay, but have sort of a weird visual effect that doesn't quite work right. They're very bonky, kind of like a hammer almost, or a club. And this just seems confusing to me. I mean, after all, we went through that media representation thing, and we compared those pretty favorably to the chain axe, which has the light attacks with latching, light draw cuts. We have the heavy attacks that cleave targets, and then we have the special attack that assassinates targets. It's all in line with the lore and media that we have. But why are the chainsword and the heavy chainsword so out of line? It's not like Fat Shark didn't seemingly do the same thing. I mean, look at the results on the chain axe. I think I have the answer. They did, and then they changed it, probably shortly before release. This is the announcement teaser for Darktide. I'm hoping you noticed what I noticed there, which is that the chain sword's light attacks have a rev lash behavior just like the chain axe does. And notably, when swung like this, those chainsword lights rev nicely. And I do think this was axed shortly before release because look at how the chainsword behaves if you let the strike stay on target for a second. I call that the chainsword wiggle, and I think it's evidence enough that I was right. And it wouldn't surprise me if there was some sort of conflict around this. In fact, I think that the heavy chainsword's light attacks also probably were designed to be this way, which is why they sort of sit on target. But since it's such a big weapon, you don't see the wiggle as much, right? The way I see it from a product manager perspective is that both parties are probably correct. On the one hand, the weapon is definitely better when those revved light attacks are in there so they can latch and deal the damage like a chainsword should, because they feel great on the chain axe, unequivocally. And a lot of the people I play with really like the light attacks on the chain axe after they get used to them, though there's a learning curve. But that learning curve is definitely a negative that might really hurt these iconic weapons, so I can see why you might want to take that out on at least some of them and give it to some others so that you could kind of do an A/B test at the very least. In any case, my proposal for how to solve these sound effects and visual effects problems is pretty straightforward. Let's take the light attacks on the heavy chainsword and the chainsword and give them their latching, locking light attacks back. These can always be tweaked a little bit. I think they need to do a little bit more damage on the chain axe, and they should on the chainsword and the heavy chainsword as well. And maybe the chainswords can do like the ticks of damage a little faster, so it's a little less dangerous, right? Either way, this instantly solves the problem with the sound effects and visual effects not making sense, not sounding good. They're now going to stick to the target and rev loudly, just like they do on the chain axe, which should completely eliminate this sort of bonkiness we're getting right now. Here's what it would sound like if you were to do that. To the best of my knowledge, I'm no dummy, and I am aware that not everybody likes the lashing attacks on light attacks. However, there are already cleaving blows on the heavy to fall back on if you need to, so it's not like you can't use these weapons without touching those. But the big thing I want to call back to is my balance videos for my various aggressive testing paradigms. I specify some balanced norms I want to achieve, and one of them is based on JTC Live's proposals. In this particular case, the one I want to call out is number 3, which is that personal skill showcases matter. When I see someone running around with a chain axe, I already know they're a good player, generally speaking, because they're having to use a weapon that is already a bit worse than most other weapons. It also has several difficult to use attacks, like the light attacks and the shred rev attacks. And this is an unusual opportunity for player skill to shine through when using a weapon that is actually harder to use than other weapons in melee combat. That can be a lot of fun and is worth keeping around and expanding upon. Now, put a pin in that conversation because it obviously leads into balance land, and we're going to go talk about that in just a second. But I want to finish off these visual effects and sound effects problems that we were talking about just before. So let's finish those off for the other weapons, but I've kind of laid out my basic justification for why light attacks having shred-based second tick damage on the chainsword, the chain axe, and the heavy chainsword are a good idea. For problems 2 and 5, the solution is right in the problem itself, which is that the heavy attacks on the chain sword and the chain axe both need some carryover on their rev sounds, just like heavy chain sword heavy attacks. As to how chain axe and chain sword heavies sound kind of bonky, well, I don't have a direct solution for that because I'm not a Foley expert, but I definitely have correctly identified the problem, and it's the sound on these ones, not the visual effects, at least not entirely. There's one point I want to touch on that. If you look at the footage again, notice that first strike is a cleaving heavy attack that dismembers the enemy. Let's just flat compare that to hitting a couple similar enemies in Damnation with the chainsword. Okay, I'm not loving that. It definitely doesn't dismember much, and it really sort of slaps them around. This is a common problem. So I've set the difficulty in this footage to Sedition, that's the lowest, and I've gone ahead and just made sure I can maximize gore, right? I've set all my settings up so that I have all the decals and all the whatever settings to maximize how much gore and dismemberment I achieve. And as you can see, the results are just very disappointing. I don't think it achieves what we're setting out to achieve. The fantasy of a chain weapon is that somehow the spinning blades make it much better at cutting. They essentially make a magic blade that allows you to slice through the enemy much more easily, except when it decides to behave like a chainsaw instead, which is actually under the player's control and is kind of based around how hard you swing the thing. And I actually really like this as a core mechanic because it gives you the ability to go between lighter swings, lighter attacks that feel like a chainsaw, and heavier attacks that feel like a magic sword that cut through everything. But it's not a power sword, right? And so what I would favor is a greater degree of dismemberment, and with heavy attacks being able to actually bisect the enemy torso section like you can do with power swords and other weapons that hit for big cleaves. I think that would make the weapons feel much more powerful without necessarily having to go ham on buffing them. Just give you more of the cool effects that make the weapon feel the way it's supposed to feel in your head. Okay, so to summarize the fix there, we're going to add more dismemberment to heavy attacks on the chain axe and the chain sword, and also the heavy chain sword's light attacks. And that, I think, brings us to a close on all of the sound and visual effects that need to be adjusted to make these weapons feel better to use. Feel can be a big part of how good a weapon is or isn't. Darktide has done a pretty good job on that, but in this case there's a few missing elements, and most of the players I talk to agree on that point. Now, this may not surprise you, considering I've mentioned it a few times already, I think, but this video has actually taken a ton of work and effort to cut and get right. I've had to recut it a few times. So I'm going to make you a deal. I think it's a good deal, so roll with me here for a second. I release this section now so that you can enjoy it and watch all of the hard work that I put into this, and I just release the balance section of the discussion in part 2 later. And then you can watch that too when it comes out. I think it's a pretty fair deal. Both of us get something out of it. You get content faster and don't have to wait another however many weeks it takes for me to finish the balance editing. And then I get to release a video that I've been working on forever and really am proud of. So I think that's a fair deal. What do you say? That's right, you can't talk back to me, so you're just gonna have to tolerate my plans. Thanks everybody for listening so very much. This has been a fun little ride, and I am looking forward to the next part of this video, which will hopefully be published fairly shortly.
Rejoice, sinners!